You're listening to Signals from the Core, a podcast about adventuring in the core sector of the Mongoose Traveller 2nd Edition role-playing game. This is where the bureaucracy is dangerous, the nobles are lethal, and where power, paranoia, and prestige collide. I'm Captain Aurelius, and I'll be your host. In each episode, we explore the tangled heart of the Third Imperium through original story hooks, people of interest, encounters, locations, and the tools you need to bring high-stakes, low-trust campaigns to life. If your crew is headed for the throne world, buckle up, because here in the core, secrets don't stay buried. Not for long. The core sector. The hallowed birthplace of the Third Imperium is a highly diverse, populous, and cosmopolitan region. While covered in myths of uniform wealth and patriotism, many backwater, low population, and freewheeling worlds exist alongside those gleaming high-tech systems. The sector is populous, but not the most populated, and wealthy, but not the wealthiest in the Imperium, though it does maintain a high concentration of high population and high-tech worlds. The point is, as we've discussed many times, the core isn't one thing. And that principle extends even to the population you'll find there and the cultures you'll encounter. Travelers exploring the core can expect to meet a remarkably complex tapestry of human subspecies and cultural factions and alien races. And I wanted to look at one of those subspecies in particular today, in a new segment called Core Cultures that should become a recurring one here on the show. Today, we'll look at the Syleans. But first, before we get started, if you'd like to share thoughts with me on the show or any of your ideas on it, please drop me a line at coresignalsmail@gmail.com or follow me at signalsfromthecore.bsky.social over on Blue Sky. Both of these addresses will be in the show notes. And please don't forget to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It really helps me out a lot. In fact, I wanted to share a couple more reviews that I got recently because I found them really encouraging and sort of, in a way, validating in that what I'm hoping listeners get from the show is what listeners are saying they get from the show is what I'm hoping they will. So take a listen to a couple of these. This one, great show, 5 stars from Black Blue Sea. He writes, I'm just a few episodes in, but this is the kind of content the Traveller RPG needs. Tons of good ideas on how to utilize elements of the rules, adventure seeds, NPC ideas, and setting details. Audio quality is good. The host varies his delivery between more prepared, scripted segments to free-flowing conversation-style delivery. Well done. I wish I could join this host for a game. Now, when I read that, I floated about 5 feet off the ground. That was just really awesome to hear, and I appreciate it so much. Thank you, Black Blue Sea. And then this one. Beautiful Traveller Pod, 5 stars from Do Not Resuscitate. Captain Aurelius does an amazing job immersing you in the Imperium and its core sector. It's a great listen and also has gameable components you could use in your own campaigns. So thank you so much, Do Not Resuscitate, for that review as well. Both of those I just found really super encouraging, and just really always makes me feel good when I get reviews like that with folks telling me that what I hope they get from the show is what they're taking away from it. And I just really, truly appreciate it. So please, you really be helping the show out and making me feel like the time I spend preparing the show and recording the show is well worth it when I get reviews like this that make me realize, yeah, a lot of you do like what I'm doing, and that makes it worth doing. So anyway, with that, let's get on with the show. The core is often described through its institutions. As we've talked about many times on this show, it's where we find the capital of the entire Imperium. It's where the Iridium Throne is, the Moot Spire, the great ministries, headquarters of huge megacorporations, and some of the most powerful noble families in all of charted space. But if we look at it only from that height, the sector can start to feel like a collection of governments and star charts rather than a place where trillions of people actually live and interact. The core should feel crowded, old, wealthy, and intensely cosmopolitan. This is the center of an Imperium spanning more than 11,000 worlds, don't forget. For centuries, people have come here to serve in the military, petition the government, attend universities, negotiate contracts, seek noble patronage. They represent their own distant worlds or come to join religious communities. They come hoping to make a fortune or place themselves as close to power as they can possibly get. Every ministry, naval command, corporate headquarters, noble court, it brings its own stream of officials, specialists, clients, retainers, lobbyists, servants, rivals, and opportunists. That's been happening here for a very long time. The core contains Sylean communities rooted in the history of the sector itself, Volani populations whose presence predate the Imperium, and family whose ancestors arrived during the rule of man or the long night. The Sylean Federation, or one of the many waves of imperial expansion that followed. You have Vargar workers who came from Antares, or Aslan, who entered imperial service, or were raised here. They represent their own clans or their own interests, because they've set out from their own homeworlds, looking for something more to establish themselves. We have BWAPs who found places in the institutions here, in its industries or legal systems, in the imperial bureaucracy itself. Then there are other human minor races from across the Imperium who've come here as soldiers, couriers, merchants, pilgrims, students, political representatives of their own worlds. On Capital, or even any other core world, a traveler might walk from a Sylean religious observance into a restaurant serving food adapted for a BWAP clientele, or specializing in Volani cuisine. They could pass an Aslan officer in the uniform of the Imperial Guard, or find an Irilatok broker waiting at a starport with cargo documents. None of these people needs to be treated as an exotic visitor. It's just a way of life here. They may have been born within a few kilometers of one another. Their families may have lived in the core for generations, even while holding on to very different ideas about loyalty, status, family, religion, property, or proper conduct, or what social status looks like. But that cosmopolitanism doesn't necessarily mean the core should feel uniformly welcoming either. Proximity creates its own frictions. Old communities protect their traditions. Noble households care about pedigree. Corporate and government institutions develop assumptions about which people are suited for what kinds of work. A Vargar may hold imperial citizenship and still be treated as disposable labor. A BWAP may command considerable authority while enduring condescension from humans who only see a bureaucratic stereotype. As an Aslan family may have served the throne for centuries and still be judged against customs followed hundreds of parsecs away. A Sylean may live on the ancestral homeworld of their people and feel that capital has swallowed everything that once made it Sylean and truly Sylean. Getting that feeling right is, to me, fundamental in how a core campaign plays. The people of the sector should appear as ordinary, as in ordinary life, as well as they do in extraordinary encounters. They should be found behind customs desks, commanding warships, running companies, maintaining stations, serving noble households, arguing cases, committing crimes, raising families. They could do anything, pursuing their own private ambitions. But their presence should tell players that they are standing at the center of a huge interstellar society where people and cultures have been colliding, mixing, competing, and adapting for centuries. It has to feel lived in and real and natural. But it comes into play more in this sector, I would argue, than any other in the setting, in charted space. Because it gives the referee more ways to create conflict than just another hostile ship or an armed confrontation. A problem may begin with incompatible ideas about honor, status, procedure, inheritance, religious obligation, or who has the authority to speak for an entire community. A character who understands those differences may solve a problem that weapons can't. Someone who ignores them could cause an incident in a room where every person present has connections reaching across the sector. So today, we're deep diving on Syleans, but in future episodes, we'll look at other cultures and races that show up across the sector as well, and get into some of the political tensions at play here that can provide a lot of texture and nuance to your games. Because that's the key to playing here in the core. That there's vast diversity and differences, and then it should never feel ordinary or regular. But in some ways it should, right? It's got to feel rich and nuanced and lived in, the same as it does in our own world, in our own lives. And how do you bring that to life without devolving into just caricatures? And that's the key. That's the key to this core cultures segment that I'm hoping to roll out and make a regular part of the show from time to time on the various episodes. So today we're talking Syleans, but in future episodes, I've already started working on one about the Bwaps, that's one of my absolute favorite species in alien race in the entire setting. I love them. I can't wait to talk about them. But we'll also look at the Vargur and how they show up in the core. And the Aslan, which the Aslan I feel I'm actually a little spicy about, because I feel like Mongoose has overdone it with the Aslan in a lot of ways. I mean, if you look at the number of Aslan source materials compared to any other, it's kind of ridiculous. You know, on one hand, I get it, but it's a little, it's frustrating to me. And I've posted about this on social, on Blue Sky before. While I do enjoy the Aslan a lot, the fact that you've got like books like Clans of the Aslan and then the new Aslan Hyrule book that just came out as the quote unquote second in the Empires line. So you've got the Third Imperium, my favorite book across the whole line. And then they call those Empire line books. The second one was supposed to be the Jodani Consulate. And somewhere along the line that got shuffled, delayed, whatever you want to call it. And the Aslan Hyrule book leapfrogged it and was released second, which bums me out a little bit, because the Fifth Frontier War with the Jodani is currently going on. I put that in quotes, currently, because it's whenever you want to play it is when it's happening. But that line of books is being released right now, and boy, wouldn't it have been awesome to have as a companion to the Third Imperium book a book talking about the other side of that conflict, the Jodani consulate. It would have made a perfect companion to that. So, that having been said, I still plan to talk about how the Aslan would show up and do show up in the core, despite my own personal feeling that the Aslan are overexposed in the Traveller setting overall. So anyway, that's me on a little bit of a soapbox, a little bit of a tangent here in the episode, but I'm not editing out, so you take it for what you will. And with that, we're going to talk about the Syleans today, and you'll get all of those folks in upcoming episodes. But before we jump to the Syleans, I just want to acknowledge the tapestry of humanity that's at play in the core. It's just a tease for other groups, because I mentioned Waps and Vargr and Aslan. But I do want to acknowledge, too, that there are other subspecies of humanity here in the core, too, that we'll talk about. I didn't want you to think that it's all going to be sort of aliens, or that I think the Syleans are the end all and be all. I just think that Syleans are uniquely core. So that, to me, was the natural starting point. But we also have, and have talked about to some degree, the Vellani in the core, and Soleimani to some degree. But there's this also idea of the Vellani and Soleimani hybrid majority. After thousands of years of coexistence, intermixing, the majority of human citizens in the core are kind of a hybrid culture that's neither pure Vellani or pure Soleimani anymore, but kind of somewhere in between, intermixed, and Sylean too, for that matter. It's just kind of all mixed, and their distinct kind of heritage, while remaining influential in some areas, are sort of blended. There's a lot of blending happening. And so I want to look at that too, while also looking at traditional Vellani roots, where they're more highly visible in subsectors like Apgi and Parit, which we've talked about to some degree, and where those local societies favor the traditional caste systems and still sort of use the Vellani language. And conversely, we'll take a kind of a closer look at Soleimani heritage, and in sort of the extremes of the Soleimani movement, and how that comes into play, and how, most humans of Soleimani descent of Soleimani descent in the core are highly integrated and remain fiercely loyal to the Imperium, but there is still that sect of Soleimani that aren't. And how do you play with that in the core sector? So I really have been meaning to take a closer look at the Soleimani for a while, and how you would play with that sort of Soleimani zealotry that comes into play in that area of space, and how and if any of that sort of trickles into the core, and how you might play with that. And then we've got the Chenastans, who are super fascinating to me. And these, sort of this area of the core that represent this sort of 25 world, formerly known as the Chenastan Kingdom, where they heavily resist assimilation into the Imperium. And Chenastan nobles are considered among the haughtiest of the peerage, and there's an active separatist factions going on in that area of space that has stirred up unrest, and they're still like pushing for creation of a cultural zone similar to that of the Syleans that we'll get into on the upcoming segment. The Chinastan worlds want their own version of what the Syleans have that is being resisted. And so there's some kind of push-pull there, some friction there of like, well, why do they get it and we don't? But there are reasons, and we'll get into that when we look at the Chinastans. And it's just, to me, an amazingly fascinating backdrop to work into your core campaigns. It's just sort of like hot button issues to be aware of as you're fleshing out for your table the way it works in the core. The things that if you're, if the way I always think about things like this is if you're a referee and you're bringing players into this campaign, and they're creating characters who, assuming they're, most of them are raised there, born there, or come there and need to be aware of certain things, either what's going to catch them unaware that makes them feel more like a fish out of water, or if they were born and of the core, the things that they would just know as people who grew up here, right? And so that's why I feel like this is such an important element of understanding how the core operates and the people within it and the differences among them. And then we have the GURPS, which is a human minor race heavily concentrated in the core on the world's crane and mirror for reasons we'll get into, where they govern with a light touch and hold the cool thing about the GURPS is they hold this with absolute conviction that they are the direct descendants of the ancients. That's what they feel. And I just find that so funny because, spoiler alert, they're not, but they believe it. And I know these fellas tend to be pretty unpopular among Traveller fans, or they tend to be. I've gotten the feeling that they're a little less popular. And I say fellas for a reason, actually, which we'll get into in the future too. Because if you know, right? But to me, though they can tend to be unpopular, I find them a lot of fun, or that they could be a lot of fun if used right. And so I'm looking forward to getting into the GURPS as well. So that just a few human subspecies that we'll also look at. So you don't think that we're just going into this with the Syleans in mind. The Syleans, I think, are the natural starting place for the core. If we're going to look at a subspecies of humanity in the core, we had to start with them. And we'll probably do the Chinastans next because it just makes sense. And then from there, we'll follow into, Villani, Soleimani, maybe mix in a few aliens. And it won't happen too. I don't want to give you the wrong impression. This isn't like it's going to be every episode for the next however many episodes. This is just sort of like from time to time, we'll do a core cultures segment similar to system spotlights or, the patron profiles. It's just another segment that I want to roll out that will be a recurring one. So, all right, with that, enough having been said, enough preamble. Let's talk about Syleans. At the heart of the Third Imperium is the culture of the Syleans, an exceptionally influential and exceedingly cooperative and industrious human minor race, whose societal principles and personal sacrifices form the bedrock of the modern empire. While the demographic majority of the Imperium is a Villani-Soleimani hybrid, it was the Sylean people who ultimately engineered humanity's rise from the ashes of the long night. The Syleans are believed to be the descendants of early hominids taken from Terra and seeded on the world of Sylean, now known as Capital, by the enigmatic ancients approximately 300,000 years ago. Physically, they evolved to be slightly taller than average humans, with pale skin, dark hair, and striking eye colors, including violet, which I love. That's my favorite. For most of their early interstellar history, they were marginalized. When Villani colonists settled Sylean around the year minus 9100, during the era of the First Imperium, or the Zero Circa, the native Syleans were pushed aside as a societal underclass. And for thousands of years, they were forced to practice their unique culture and religions in secret. But their fortunes shifted dramatically during the interstellar wars, when the Terran conquerors, or the Soleimani, from basically Earth, established the rule of man. Recognizing the Syleans as a distinct people who had suffered under Villani rule, the Soleimani elevated them to positions of power, which sparked a massive revival of Sylean culture. Sylean ultimately became the very last capital of the rule of man before the empire completely collapsed in the year minus 1776, and which ushered in the Dark Ages known as the Long Night. But as interstellar civilization degraded and countless worlds died out, Sylean managed to retain some of its technology and eventually rebuilt its fusion power capabilities. In the year minus 650, the Sylean people threw off the authoritarian Soleimani monarchy that ruled them and established a democratic Sylean federation, which was led by a Grand Senate and a president. They embarked on an ambitious mission to reestablish trade, communication, and diplomacy with surrounding star systems. Their inherent cultural drive for cooperation, spiritual contemplation, and economic prosperity helped them absorb surrounding worlds and defeat rival pocket empires like the Interstellar Confederacy and the Chinastan Kingdom, which I mentioned in the previous segment. By the final decades of the Federation, under the leadership of the visionary Grand Duke and President Cleon Zunastu, whose name should be familiar, the Syleans began recruiting powerful, distant allies like the Villani in Vland to join their trade federation. Realizing that a centralized government could not rule the massive expanse of space that they were acquiring, Cleon issued the warrant for the restoration of the Imperium. And on the first day of year zero, the Sylean Federation officially dissolved itself to become the Third Imperium, and Sylean was renamed Capital. So that's kind of a history lesson of how the Third Imperium came to be. If you want more details of this, I can't recommend the Third Imperium sourcebook enough. But that's just kind of the quick and dirty version of how the Third Imperium was born and why the Syleans get so much credit for it. Because they kind of allowed for it to happen. They were in control. And they sort of dissolved their own federation to bring other people to the table and create this imperium. Of course, Cleon Zunastu was the first emperor of the Third Imperium, so he did benefit from it. But the point is, it was bigger than just the Sylean Federation. It was the big tent, to borrow a phrase. But the Syleans fully understood that they were a demographic minority in the grand scale of the empire that they'd basically just created through trade and opening up trade routes. And to ensure their legacy, they embarked on an aggressive population expansion project. So that today, the Kasky and the core subsectors are home to billions of genetically pure and mixed heritage Syleans. Their culture remains distinct from the rest of the Imperium as well. And that's kind of what comes into play here in this area of space, and why I felt like the Syleans were the natural place to start with this. So first, you've got the Sylean world's cultural zone, which I talked about in the previous segment with regard to this is the area of space that the Chenastans are sort of jealous of. Like, hey, the Syleans have one, we want our own cultural zone. This was a reward for their foundational contributions and their sacrifice during the Imperial Civil War, that the Imperium granted them this cultural zone. One of the core tenets of modern Sylean culture is their devotion to peace. And the Sylean worlds are almost completely demilitarized. They have no permanent navy or and not a lot of scout bases, right? And except for Capital itself and Yersh Poi, both of which are actually in the core subsector. In the Kasky subsector, which the majority of the Sylean worlds in the cultural zone are, they are pretty much all demilitarized. Syleans view flashy technology as a distraction from spiritual and family life, and they prefer that while they have advanced technology, they want it to be seamlessly and unobtrusively integrated into their environment. It has to feel natural because it allows them to sort of focus on their philosophical pursuits and their industriousness without being overly infatuated or distracted by advanced technology. And I mentioned that the Sylean population expansion project, that was where there were these massive demographic initiatives driven by the Syleans' desire to build a long and lasting cultural legacy and establish an enduring presence across a greater number of worlds. Because remember, they sort of knew that they were in the minority, and so they, basically wanted to change that. Because despite being the foundational architects of the Third Imperium, they realized we're only a tiny demographic of this new empire. And so to ensure that their culture wasn't lost and that they maintained an influence and that Sylean people would survive on a galactic scale, they did this aggressive population push. It's basically be fruitful and multiply. And that's what Sylean families were actively encouraged to just, have at it and populate this section of the galaxy. And the most prominent fruits of this project can be seen in the Kasky subsector. And this is where the Syleans pushed into new territory, trailing Capital. So if you're looking at the sector map, trailing in, I know I'm going to catch flack for this, but it's a flat map in our physical space. So I'm going to use this directionally, but if you're looking at the subsector map, the trailing is to the right of core is Kasky. The This came after the betrayal of the 10, what's called the wayward worlds, that resisted being part of the Imperium as well. This is different than the Chenastans, but the wayward worlds did not want to be assimilated either. That is, they are in very close proximity to the Sylean worlds. In fact, I think all of the wayward worlds are in the core subsector. So that's a dynamic too that we'll have to talk about eventually. But the Kasky subsector grew to boast the second highest population in the entire core sector, because of the success of the population expansion projects. So think about that. The Kasky subsector is the second most populous subsector in the entire sector, with now over 48 billion Syleans living just within the Kasky subsector alone. It's not accounting for the ones that are in core, because remember, two of the larger planets, Capital and Yershpoi, are in the core subsector, as well as, let me just pull up the map here. I'll do this on the fly. Yeah, you've also got Rylea, Canian, First, Rib, Nesdo, Shutasham. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. There's almost a dozen planets of the Sylean worlds in the core subsector. So, the fact that, the second most populated subsector in all of the sector is in Kasky doesn't even account for the billions of Syleans living in the neighboring core sector. That's a big population of Syleans across both. But still, it's still a minority. So you can't forget that. And now I'm going to read verbatim from the Third Imperium source book. There's a whole page in the Third Imperium source book in the section on the Kasky subsector that talks all about the Syleans. And I just thought, let's just read it. It's one page out of the book. It's a lot of good information. And it starts with their physical appearance, but it even gets into some information about creating Syleans. I thought indispensable for our look at Syleans here. Syleans are physically similar to Solomoni humans with some minor differences. They're slightly taller with an average height of almost 2 meters. Their skin is very light, nearly white in some cases, while their hair color is almost universally dark brown to black, creating a stunning contrast. Sylean eye color tends to the extremes from an almost crystalline gray or blue to a deep dark brown, appearing almost black. I've also read some things that they can have violet eyes, which is the one I like to choose the most, because I just love that kind of idea of The primary differences between Syleans and other human subspecies are not physical, but cultural. Syleans are a focused and driven race, guided by a long history of oppression at the hands of the Villani and Solomoni invaders. While most are now of mixed heritage, having bred with Villani and Solomoni humans, there are still billions of genetically pure Syleans due to the fact that many were isolated in remote reservations on their homeworld deep into the long night and maintained their purity even after leaving Sylea for other star systems. The Syleans are a spiritual and philosophical people. The introduction of interstellar travel and high technology has not disconnected them from religious practices, meditation, spiritual contemplation, or any number of other pursuits that have disappeared from the lives of many of their human brethren. Characteristics. Sylean travelers have the following modifiers applied to their characteristics at character generation. They get a -1 to strength, but a +1 to education. And they have traits. They have a cooperation trait. Syleans are exceptionally cooperative with others of their species. So when on a Sylean world, which is a world with a Sylean population of 50% or more, Sylean travelers will receive a +2 dice modifier on admin, diplomat, and streetwise checks. This reflects the Syleans' innate ability to close ranks and cooperate with one another to achieve a desired goal. Then some guidance on their careers. Almost all of the careers listed in the Traveler Core Rulebook are suitable for Sylean travelers, but the Drifter and Rogue careers require additional explanation. So this page goes on to say that in the Drifter career, Sylean barbarians and wanderers should be exceedingly rare. The Sylean worlds are old and well developed, and there are few low-tech worlds to be found. However, a Sylean might purposely go to a primitive world, perhaps on a journey of spiritual discovery. Most Syleans are very directed and would rarely slip into the wanderer career, although there can always be exceptions. And then on the rogue career, it says most Syleans gravitate toward honorable professions that provide them with financial and spiritual prosperity, avoiding those that directly involve them in crime for crime's sake. That said, they are no more or less ethical than humans of any other kind, and might indulge in underworld-oriented activities if there are extenuating circumstances. And then it gives for instance, a thief might be in the employ of a corporation engaged in skullduggery to acquire goods and intelligence by underhanded means. An enforcer might be in the employ of a Sylean cartel or syndicate, which are remarkably similar to the organized crime organizations of any other species. Syleans are unlikely to operate as independent pirates, but may very well serve as corporate privateers or corsairs who raid enemy shipping with a letter of marque. And then the priesthood or believer career, it says that in addition to the above career choices, many Syleans are religious and subscribe to one of the traditional Sylean faiths. Sylean travelers in the priesthood may use the believer career from the Traveler Companion, which is a great book if you don't have it. And then on wealth and prosperity, Syleans are driven by a desire for prosperity and wealth and receive a +1 dice modifier on all cash benefit rolls when mustering out of their careers. So how about that one? So that is a look at a lot of what is said about the Syleans in the Third Imperium sourcebook. Next up, we're going to take a look at what was written in a source book from GURPS Traveller, which I highly recommend. We'll talk about that on the next segment. So there is a book from GURPS Traveller called Humaniti, which is a book I highly recommend to supplement the Mongoose source materials. And the beauty of it is you can pick it up and choose what you want, right? The great thing about several of the GURPS books is that while the rules themselves don't really line up, the concepts and the background materials are fantastic for adding additional flavor and color to what Mongoose provide. So while this podcast is pretty steadfast in viewing Mongoose second edition materials as the official canon and established lore, I do like to dip into past editions to round out my knowledge of the setting, and have done that more and more over the years. And in just the year since I guess the year or so now that I've been doing this podcast, I've added a number of non-Mongoose materials to my collection. This is thanks to the generous benefactor who shared the Traveler's Digest publications with me. And then also taking advantage of several humble bundles or bundles of holding that have given me a lot of classic Traveler books. I actually think I own all of the classic Traveler books digitally now. But picking up the GURPS books was due entirely to listener feedback just within the past year, with folks letting me know that I should really check them out. And so now I'm passing along that recommendation. Check them out. We'll look at others as well. And I kind of have cited it a couple of times, I think. But the GURPS Humanity, it gives us some great additional and sometimes differing details on the Syleans that I wanted to share with you today. I'll drop a link to where you can pick it up for yourself. You can still get it on Steve Jackson Games. You get it digitally. I mean, you could probably get a physical version too. You just probably have to pay more and pick it up on eBay or whatever. I don't think it's in print, but they still sell it on PDF, which you can find on Steve Jackson Games. But like I said, I'll put a link in the show notes so you can find it. But anyway, I wanted to kind of get into this. In GURPS, there's a whole section in this book on Syleans. And they're labeled the orphan branch of humanity. So just like in Mongoose, they're transplanted from Terra, abandoned by the ancients for reasons that remain unknown. And then the timeline details are different. I mean, they line up. I mean, I think the years all sort of line up, but it's much more detailed. And I think it even extends back farther. But by minus 12,500, Sylean agricultural communities were thriving in what they call, the GURPS writers called Bren Tan Pem, in the Bren Tan Pem region of Sylia, or which means Sylia's fertile crescent. Over the subsequent millennia, Sylean civilization progressed naturally from bronze working and city-states to more territorial empires. And then you sort of get this timeline where I think just like this aligns with Mongoose, minus 9100, there was first contact with the Villani during a wave of Villani exploration. And Sylia was initially of little interest of land, but the contact dramatically reshaped Sylean culture, especially in the coastal and mountainous, what they call Tas Var Ken culture district. And I'm including all of this because I want to make a point, including these areas and in the way it's structured, because I found it fascinating how the linguistics work. So I wanted to include that. Then in minus 8,500, applying the ideas introduced by the Villani merchants, the Tas Var Ken developed empirical science, philosophy, and a limited democracy. They developed iron forging and advanced shipbuilding, and eventually unified Sylia under what was called the Sarnese Empire, which centered on the city of Ton Sarn. And the empire later bought tech level 5 weaponry from the Villani Bureau Sharashid to consolidate its rule. So it kind of went from little sort of tribal factions to this unified Sarnese empire. Then in minus 8,000 came the Villani colonization due to a shift in Villani corporate politics. This is when Nasurka gained the rights to colonize Sylean, and they arrived when the Sarnese Empire was sort of starting to decline, and they came in and exploited that Sylean disunity to spark local civil wars, and then eventually just sort of conquered the planet using their higher tech level, it was tech level 9 armaments, which, tech level 9 versus tech level 5 that they had just bought, 500 years earlier. So by minus 7,500, all significant Sylean resistance had ended, which, if you think about it, that's like 500 years of strife and resistance. So that's a little wild. But anyway, that's what the material says. And then negative 6,900, most native Syleans had been assimilated into Villani society and had sort of started losing their identity. Sarnese refugees fled into the high, rugged Mer-Ren-Thailen mountain range, and the Villani largely ignored them because the mountains lacked strategic value, so they just kind of let them go, let them be, and that officially established the Sylean reservation in minus 6,900, and over the next 4,000 years, these reservation Syleans survived by becoming fiercely conservative, clannish, and insular, and refused to marry outsiders. So that's a little bit of a juxtaposition there, where, if you remember, when we were talking about the Mongoose materials, references were made to living on reservations, right? But doesn't go into a lot of details. You sort of find those details in this GURPS section on Syleans about what those Sylean reservations were and what that life was like. Then in minus 2218, when the Soleimani defeated the First Imperium and arrived on Sylean, they discovered the reservation's distinct culture and granted them cultural autonomy as a useful peace propaganda, so that there is a little bit more detail on what was alluded to in the Mongoose materials about how when the Soleimani came in and established the rule of man, they kind of lifted the Syleans up, liberated them. This is a little bit more detail about that. Then during the decline of the rule of man around minus 1900, Sylean nationalism erupted. The reservation Syleans began reconstructing that late Sarnese culture, reviving Old Sylean as a scholarly language and adopting the name Thar Ven, which means successors, which we'll more on that in a bit. But we talked about, with the Mongoose materials, their physiology and physical appearance, that there are details of that here with GURPS as well that I wanted to share, just so we could sort of compare and contrast. Pure-blooded Syleans are biologically human, but possess distinct traits shaped by genetic drift and environmental adaptation. So on size. So remember, in Mongoose, it was talked about how they're a little bit taller. Right here, we get more specifics on the size difference. They're slightly taller and more massive than the average Soleimani. Those who grew up in Capital's lower gravity environment adapt physically. Males average 14 inches taller and 50 pounds heavier than the human baseline, while females average 10 inches taller and 35 pounds heavier. Holy moly. Then the few other details: 60% of Syleans are left-handed, 10% are albino, Interestingly, albinoism is considered highly attractive and acts as an upper class status symbol, signifying that an individual does not need to perform outdoor labor. So I found that super interesting. Their facial features, a little bit more detail here. A lot of consistency. So their skin is pale. Their hair is usually dark brown or black. Eyes, dark brown, steel gray, or violet. So I got the violet part from GURPS, which is, mainly consistent with a mongoose. But a few other details. Syleans typically have round heads, broad faces, wide set eyes, long noses, and very square, prominent chins. So a few other details. If you're an artist, that's how you would draw them. I, however, am not an artist, unfortunately. Makes me sad every day. So now why I spent so much time on the places and the names and the structures and why I wanted to include that in my recap here, because we get information on their language and naming conventions in the GURPS material. So they go into detail on how there are 2 surviving languages. And that while almost all Syleans speak Galanglic, traditionalists maintain that old Sylean, which is used for their liturgy and scholarship. And then there's modern or low Sylean, which is used for daily conversation among the successors, which again we'll get to in a second here. The linguistic structure is that Sylean languages are highly isolating and monosyllabic and tonal, which bears a strong structural resemblance to Mandarin or Vietnamese here on Earth. And the names, they have a strict 3-word naming structure representing their clan name, family name, and given name in that order. So that's how Sylean, well, especially the successor naming structure is for Syleans, for those sort of purist throwback Syleans. Then we get a bunch of information from GURPS on Syleans culturally, with a view into their sort of psychology and their Maar Zon religion in ways that Mongoose barely touches on or only really alludes to. So if you remember, they talk about spirituality and religions being important to Syleans. We don't get detail on what that religion is. It's all here in the GURPS material. They name the religion. They give some ideas on doctrine to the religion. So we'll talk about that here. We have I've mentioned the Thar Ven, or the successors, who see themselves as the keepers of Sylea's reconstructed pre-Villani culture. And that's rising from Sylean nationalism during the decline of the rule of man. This identity sort of emerged as reservation Syleans sought to reclaim the heritage of that Sarnese empire that was tamped down, if you remember, by the invasion or the kind of the takeover by Nasurka and the Villani. So they sought to reclaim that Sarnese empire feel in that era, which they consider the last great era of Sylean independence. And their culture is a unique hybrid. So the Thar Ven culture is a unique hybrid of Sarnese archaeological reconstructions, long-standing mountain reservation customs, and Solomoni-influenced legal practices. So the defining element of the Thar Ven culture is what's known as Maar Zon, which means followers of the way, which is a monotheistic faith revived in the early Long Night from a translated text called the Maar Zon, or the Book of the Way. And Marists believe that a supreme deity, created the universe, and then withdrew because they don't believe the creator hears or answers prayers. Yet they do daily prayer, and they practice it purely as a form of meditation and devotion rather than appeals to a god. And their faith emphasizes living an honest, self-reliant, productive, and moderate life in the present while working to discover and further the universe's purpose of, toward a reincarnation. The culture has no traditional priesthood hierarchy. Instead, communities are guided by what's known as Kel Ten Zon, which translates to masters of the way. And to qualify, these guys have to be pure-blooded Sylean and pass a grueling academic trial that includes memorizing the entire Maar Zon, which is comparable to the Christian Bible in length. And they have to memorize that entire book verbatim in Old Sylean, which is, remember, a super archaic language, only used for liturgy and official texts. Worshippers gather at these what's called together teaching places, quote unquote, which in Sylean is Van Tel Shan. So in these Van Tel Shan facilities, each have roughly 1,000 members and are basically like churches or synagogues where practitioners pray, study, distribute charity, and each local congregation is governed by an odd-numbered religious council of the Kel Ten Zon. And while the councils don't or can't legally enforce religious law, they can and do cast out disgraced individuals from the congregation. And so effectively, they do have the power to excommunicate them from Sylean society. So there are outcasts. I guess you could play with that sort of idea. Devout Marists must pray daily, avoid alcohol and other intoxicants, and strictly limit any display of affluence, keeping their homes, vehicles, and clothing simple and functional. However, because Syleans are generally affluent due to early mining wealth and cultural thrift, this prohibition on affluence is the most commonly evaded rule in the modern era, according to the text. But that's another example of how, that there's an element of that concept that finds its way into Mongoose as well, in terms of how the Syleans are affluent, do crave or pursue affluence, but not in a gregarious or open sort of on full display way. They're sort of a little bit quiet about it, we'll say. The Thar Ven's traditional practices frequently put them at odds with local planetary laws across the Imperium as well, because in a couple of ways. First, and this is fascinating, they generally reject the notion of intellectual property. So in Marist theology, all ideas belong exclusively to the creator, capital C creator. So not the creator of the idea itself, the creator. And so therefore can't be claimed as mortal property. Can't be claimed as the lowercase c creator. So consequently, devout Syleans can't copyright or patent their innovations or inventions. To adapt, Thar Ven communities fund nonprofit organizations that publish literature, art, and software directly into the public domain. In business, they rely heavily on trade secrecy and copy protection technologies to compete with non-Marist corporations. Because of this stance, Syleans are sometimes accused of being thieves or pirates in systems that have strict patent laws, because the Syleans just don't adhere to those principles, at least devout Maris believers. In GURPS, so in GURPS, the Sylean tradition also permits polygamy and taking concubines, which serves as a frequent source of political and social tension in non-Sylean areas and among non-Sylean governments. So in a lot of ways, I mean, I suppose you could kind of sort of think of, there are some parallels, let's say, to Mormonism, maybe, especially with the, they can't drink. Polygamy is a thing. These are some, I'm thinking back to when I would watch, what was that HBO series? Anyway, I digress. And then then we get a look at the Sylean language and their naming conventions, which we touched on a little bit, but just to go into some deeper detail. While Galanglic is spoken for daily trade, traditionalists maintain Old Sylean, which is that Sarnese dialect that scholars use, and the language of liturgy and the official sort of documentation. But there's also modern or Low Sylean, which, a few more details on that, is the daily language of the successors, and integrates, is kind of like a blend of Villani and Galanglic intermixed and mingled with some peppering of Old Sylean. So it's just kind of like a whole mishmash. Both language are highly isolating, tonal, and maintain that monosyllabic Mandarin or Vietnamese type language. And it's expressed by linking strings of single syllable words, which isn't something explicitly carried over into Mongoose, but neither is it contradicted. So I've pretty much adapted it because I think it helps differentiate it a lot from Villani, and I sort of like it, which again is why I kind of included so many details of all the names of things that in the grander scheme don't really matter, but I wanted you to kind of get a feel for how it sounds, because they just go into a lot of detail on it. And I found it really, really fascinating. On population, while there are about 2 billion successors in the Imperium in the GURPS setting, they also remain a minority here as well. So even on their homeworld of Capital, where they, in GURPS, they make up only 1.2 billion of the 36 billion residents. So remember, one of the largest disparities between GURPS and Mongoose consistently is population. And we talked about that, I think, when I did the profile on Capital itself and kind of looked at the wide discrepancy of what Mongoose put forth as the population compared to what you find on the Traveller Wiki, which I think a lot comes from GURPS, actually. But I've encountered this a number of times, so just always bear that in mind when you're, talking population numbers and things. Those are usually the most incongruent, and that holds true here as well. What I typically do in situations like that is sort of think in terms of percentages, and then just kind of like, give it, my gut feeling if that's appropriate. Because Mongoose doesn't typically break it down in quite as much detail as GURPS does, but they do give you some idea on overall population. So when that happens, I just kind of go with the percentage. But in any case, that minority status here in GURPS, as similarly in Mongoose, makes them sort of fiercely protective of their identity and their culture. And so in Mongoose, that manifested into the population drive, call it. In here, it just kind of shows up in a different way. So successors here stubbornly resist intermarrying with outsiders, and Syleans who fall into deep poverty or marry outside of the community are slowly lost to assimilation, creating this. They almost become ostracized and yeah. And then another note here that there is a trend called the authentic movement, which has inspired non-Sylean imperial citizens to study Old Sylean, read Sarnese literature, and convert to Maar Zon on their own. But the successors actively resent and discourage this imitation and have taken to enforcing extremely strict requirements for conversion before allowing outsiders to even associate with them. So I just found that really interesting too, and a cool detail. So anyway, there you have it. A little more flavor to take or leave as you like from GURPS. I will say that the Maar Zon and Maar Zon it does have a place in my Traveller universe, but with some differing details. I've also tried to adapt the naming structure as well, just because I find it cool and it works for me. And I've started developing a faction I'm calling Sarzon, or True Way, the True Way movement, that kind of plays into some elements that maybe we'll get into in a future patron profile or faction spotlight that we can look at. But yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this look. Like I said, you'll find the link to this GURPS Humanity book in the show notes. And yeah, there you have it. That's the Syleans as they appear and are talked about in the Mongoose source material, as well as GURPS. All right, that's our show for this time, everyone. A little bit of a shorter show this time out. I've had a lot going on recently, so it's been harder to focus up. But I'm still resolute in my efforts to continue it regularly, even when life gets in the way. So thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Next time, we'll probably take a look at crime in the core, which is a topic I've been toying with for quite a little while, and a concept I like to call rotten to the core, which I may have mentioned several episodes back. I think I toyed with that idea, or at least mentioned it. I also recently got my physical copies of the Singularity campaign, so you could probably reasonably expect the show to adopt that more audio zine quality I talked about a while back, as I adapt my real world prep for running that sandbox campaign into materials you can borrow from by sharing them here on the show. So more system spotlights, patron profiles, faction files, and whatever other alliterative segments I can think up for you to put into your referee toolkit. Until then, write the show at coresignalsmail@gmail.com or follow along on Blue Sky at signalsfromthecore.bsky.social. You can find this info in our show notes, along with a link tree to make it easy to locate the show online anytime. You'll also find links to some of the publications that we talked about in this episode. And if you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and share the show with your fellow travelers. And who knows, if you write a 5-star review and say really nice things about me, it could be read right here on the show, because I really do appreciate them and love them, and they make me feel good, and like I'm spending, like it's worth my time to record the show every other week. So think about that, and you'd really be helping me out a lot, and it doesn't really take a lot of your time to show that kindness and let me know that you appreciate the show. So please do consider that on Apple Podcasts and Spotify especially. Until next time, keep your clearance valid, your comms encrypted, and your grav line out of committee oversight. Stay sharp, travelers.